The figure recognized historically as Socrates, or in Greek, Socrates, lived from approximately 470 to 468 BC in the Athenian village of Alopi, a suburb of this Greek city-state situated just southeast of its city walls. Although he is undeniably one of the foundational intellectual figures of Western civilization and among history's most influential philosophers and thinkers, surprisingly, little definitive biographical information about Socrates is known to researchers. His father, Socrates, was described in certain accounts as a stonemason or sculptor, while his mother, Phinerete, was reportedly a midwife. Initially, these specifics might suggest a working-class background for Socrates, which was likely not the case. As a prominent public educator in Athens during his era, Socrates almost certainly benefited from an elite education during his youth. Furthermore, his intimate circle of friends and associates included some of Athens' wealthiest, most distinguished, and most powerful citizens. A circumstance that seems particularly improbable for the offspring of a low-status, working-class family, even in the early days of Athenian democracy. This compilation of assumptions serves as merely one illustration of the primary methods employed by contemporary scholars to construct a biography of the historical Socrates. This undertaking has proven to be both challenging and persistently frustrating for historians due to the comparative scarcity of dependable sources. A significant impediment to our comprehension of Socrates is that he produced no writings himself. All our knowledge of him stems from the writings of other ancient scholars and chroniclers. Some of these sources are deemed more trustworthy than others, although virtually none can be regarded as conclusively authoritative by current standards for various reasons. The majority of historians tend to afford greater credence to the biographical details concerning Socrates that appear in the dialogues penned by Plato and Xenophon. This is because both of these writers were pupils and companions of Socrates himself. Recollections of Socrates would have still been relatively fresh for the populace of Athens when dialogues such as Plato's Apology and Crito, or Xenophon's Memorabilia, were initially circulated, approximately 10 to 20 years following his demise. It is logical to assume that if the biographical accounts of Plato and Xenophon had deviated substantially from what Athenians recalled of Socrates' behavior, his teachings, or his trial and execution, rebuttals would likely have surfaced in the literary and historical record. Consequently, Plato and Xenophon may offer a more accurate depiction of the historical Socrates compared to other sources, the majority of which were composed many decades or even centuries after Socrates' death by ancient scholars like Aristotle, Diogenes Laertius, and Plutarch. Have you ever pondered the nature of consciousness and its origins? These inquiries rank among the most profound unsolved mysteries in science. For centuries, scientists and philosophers have been perplexed by the connection between mind and matter. In his groundbreaking new book, The Dawn of Mind, Dr. James Cook, a neuroscientist trained at Oxford and a friend of this channel, proposes a compelling and innovative solution to this enigma. The Dawn of Mind delves into the history of the science and philosophy of consciousness and provides a captivating and thorough examination of how consciousness emerged. Reviewers have described the book as a gripping exploration of consciousness that reads like a Dan Brown thriller. Essential reading for anyone seeking to understand the greatest enigma of our time. And The Dawn of Mind is not merely a book about consciousness. It is an experience, a clear-eyed, concise course on the mysteries of life and consciousness, including your role in existence. Despite the aforementioned points, there remains justification for approaching the dialogues of Plato and Xenophon with a degree of skepticism regarding the precise accuracy with which they may have portrayed or quoted Socrates. Both writers would have been susceptible to bias due to their deep respect for him as their revered teacher and mentor. Indeed, their reverence for Socrates' wit and wisdom is readily apparent in their texts. Furthermore, it is plausible that these authors may have molded Socrates' words and actions to suit their own rhetorical or literary objectives. This is not to imply that either Plato or Xenophon, or any other ancient writer, historian, or chronicler might have acted with malicious or deliberately deceptive intent. Certain historians have observed that it was customary in ancient literature to honor significant figures by crediting them with heroic deeds or commendable concepts, or even by writing works under their name. Some writers might have even attributed their own words to more renowned, respected, or beloved individuals to lend legitimacy to their own theses and ideas, a practice that many scholars believe both Plato and Xenophon engaged in to some extent in their dialogues concerning Socrates. Considering all these factors, attempting to reconstruct the historical Socrates might appear to some as a futile endeavor, given that none of the surviving sources can be deemed reliable by contemporary standards. However, this has certainly not deterred historians from trying, and numerous writers and researchers throughout the preceding 2.5 millennia have persisted, despite these challenges, in pursuing a clearer understanding of Socrates. Limited information exists concerning his early life and adolescence, but historians have endeavored to piece together a picture of it using the sparse details available in the Socratic canon, combined with our historical understanding of the lives of boys and men in classical Athens. The village of Alopi, Socrates' birthplace, was home to approximately 3,000 residents, slightly over a third of whom were Athenian citizens. Only freeborn Athenian men were eligible for citizenship. The remaining population of the deme, or village, of Alopi would have consisted of slaves, women, children, and non-Athenian foreigners, none of whom were eligible for citizenship. The known life experiences of Socrates strongly suggest that he was himself an Athenian citizen. His attainment of citizenship itself likely indicates that his father, Sophroniscus, was also an Athenian citizen. Having stated that, Sophroniscus, as a skilled tradesman, probably did not originate from a particularly affluent or aristocratic background. However, the comparatively privileged upbringing that his son Socrates appears to have experienced suggests that he had achieved some financial success in his profession and had attained a degree of social standing in his community. Sophroniscus counted highly influential and wealthy Athenians among his acquaintances, such as Lamprus, the son of the Athenian statesman Aristides the Just. If Sophroniscus was indeed a stonemason or sculptor, he was likely not a lowly artisan or laborer, but perhaps the foreman of his own workshop or quarry, a master mason. Descriptions of Socrates' mother Phainarete imply that she was of higher birth than Sophroniscus, another factor suggesting the probable professional and social success of her husband. We possess even less information about Phainarete than about Sophroniscus. In one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates referred to her as a Maya, or midwife, but it remains uncertain whether this was meant in a literal, professional sense. Some scholars contemplate whether Socrates was speaking metaphorically and was instead alluding to a maternal or nurturing quality in his mother. Athenian married women, even those of high social standing, had numerous domestic responsibilities, implying that such women might not have had extensive time to dedicate to pursuing a profession. However, according to one study of a small sample of ancient inscriptions, the majority of professional midwives identified in classical Greece were freeborn women of respectable, if not high social status. Such women even published medical texts and lectured publicly in their area of expertise. Thus, it is possible that Phainarete might have been a legitimately practicing midwife at some point in her life. Organized public education was non-existent in Athens during Socrates' time. He would have learned to read and write at home, most likely with a tutor, often an enslaved non-Athenian Greek or other foreigner captured in war. Nearly all Athenian families of middle class or upper class status owned at least a few slaves, and some of these individuals were tasked with educating the family's children until the age of 12, primarily teaching them to read and write, and possibly also basic arithmetic. The male children of freeborn and affluent Athenians during the 5th century BC appear to have enjoyed considerable freedom and stimulation. While they were expected to be quiet and obedient in adult company, boys nonetheless frequently accompanied their fathers into public spaces and adult gatherings. Young Socrates likely attended theatrical productions, religious festivals, athletic contests, informal public debates, or even banquets at the homes of family friends with his father. Athenian culture also placed significant emphasis on physical health and leisure, and consequently, games, sport, and exercise were valued and encouraged for boys of all ages. Athenian boys learned to swim and wrestle. They played games of chance against each other with knucklebones, similar to dice games. By the age of 12, Athenian boys of middle to high social status typically commenced lessons in gymnastics and music. Training at the gymnasia was emphasized as essential not only for personal health, but also to cultivate strength and fitness among young, aspiring male citizens who would be required to serve in the military. Music studies in classical Athens were far more comprehensive as a subject area than they are today. The study of music encompassed not only learning to play an instrument, such as the lyre, the flute, or the aulos, a double reed pipe, but also the study of dance and poetry. Under the guidance of the renowned music master Lamprus, young Socrates learned to play the lyre, lessons which he resumed again in middle age when the musician Konos began to instruct him in newer, more innovative playing techniques. In his youth, Socrates would have been taught to sing and dance, to memorize and recite poetry by Homer, Pindar, Sappho, Anacreon, and other lyric poets. As we observe, music studies encompassed not only music and dance, but also literature, since much lyric poetry was set to music. Intriguingly, music in classical Athens offered a substantial amount of history study and religious education, in addition to training in the artistic disciplines of music and dance. This is because poets were not merely poets, but also frequently historians and documentarians of the legends of the gods, and music and dance were often fundamental in classical Greek religious rites. This period of musical and gymnastic education in Socrates' young life probably lasted for 2 to 4 years. It is also conceivable that Socrates might have commenced apprenticing in his father's trade sometime during his teenage years or early 20s. Athenian law mandated that fathers secure a professional livelihood for their sons by the time they reached adulthood, and it was fairly common for boys to pursue the same professions as their fathers. Socrates may have spent some months or years working as a mason or sculptor in his father's workshop. Yet, even if he did, it may not have been something demanded of him, but perhaps something he pursued merely to occupy himself and stay fit until he came of age and qualified for military service, something that was required of every young Athenian male citizen in Socrates' era. In 454 BC, when Socrates was approximately 15 years old, the Athenian assembly voted to relocate the treasury of the Delian League from the island of Delos to Athens, ostensibly to shield it from potential incursions by the Persians, whom the Greek member states of the Delian League had collectively defeated just a few decades prior. While this immense war chest, filled with gold and silver, had been established for all of the League's member states, who all contributed to it annually for their mutual defense, the rulers of Athens, Pericles and the assembly, evidently regarded it more as a suggestion than a binding requirement. This marked the commencement of a sequence of developments that ultimately led to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Pericles utilized the Delian treasury to benefit and beautify the city of Athens, which still bore the scars of the Persian invasion. He initiated an ambitious building program that encompassed impressive public edifices and spaces. The crowning achievement of this revitalization project was the Parthenon, the exquisite temple of white marble erected atop the Acropolis, housing a magnificent ivory and gold statue of the goddess Athena within its temple sanctuary. Undoubtedly, the masons, sculptors, and other stoneworkers in Athens, perhaps even Socrates' father Sophroniscus, received numerous commissions and profited handsomely from Pericles' building program. The Delian League soon began to disintegrate as its member states grew increasingly incensed that their annual tributes, intended for the defense of all, appeared instead to be merely enriching the city of Athens. Pericles soon commenced launching military actions against these so-called rogue states who refused to continue paying tribute. Rather than a member state in a confederacy of equals, Athens was beginning to conduct itself increasingly like an imperialist power, and other Greek states, such as Sparta and Corinth, began to mobilize against Athens and her remaining allies. By the time Socrates reached adulthood, Athens would require every available citizen soldier ready to confront a series of armed conflicts that would persist intermittently for over 30 years. In the interim, Socrates was still completing his education. At some juncture in his mid to late teens, the philosopher Archelaus became a tutor and mentor to Socrates. Archelaus was a student of the natural philosopher Anaxagoras, who was among the first thinkers to attribute the workings of the cosmos to natural rather than divine phenomena. Having examined a fallen meteorite, Anaxagoras theorized that the sun was a fiery rock rather than the god Helios, as the Greeks believed. He further posited, correctly as it turned out, that moonlight was merely reflected sunlight. He similarly sought to elucidate phenomena such as volcanoes, earthquakes, and rainbows as likewise arising from natural processes rather than the divine wrath or benevolence of the gods. In his travel journal, a contemporary scholar, Ion of Chios, reported that in 451 BC, Socrates visited the island of Samos with his tutor Archelaus. It is probable that Archelaus wished to introduce his young pupil to another of his own teachers, fellow natural philosopher Melissus of Samos. This journey represents one of the few instances in Socrates' life when he was said to have left his home city-state of Athens, and may have been comparable to a modern post-graduation tour. In Plato's Apology, Socrates speaks of the fascination he held in his youth for the study of the natural world, although he eventually came to regard the burgeoning field of natural science as less useful and less relevant to society than other philosophical pursuits and concerns. Having mentors and teachers like Archelaus undoubtedly helped to awaken and foster in Socrates an empirical inclination of mind, which would prove pivotal to the subsequent development of his own philosophical framework. At the commencement of the Greek New Year after Socrates reached the age of 18, he would have presented himself before the council of his Deime, where he would have attained his citizenship and independence. He would have been eligible to claim any property or wealth held in trust for him, eligible to submit for election by lot to public office, for example, as a magistrate or justice of the peace, and eligible to attend and vote in the Athenian assembly. At this juncture in his life, an Athenian citizen was largely free to act as he pleased in a professional and personal capacity. In Pericles' Athens, however, the growing need for a robust military force meant that most young men and citizens of Socrates' age were conscripted for military training. The fact that Socrates appears to have become a career soldier for much of his life also attests to his family's comparatively high status. The expense of outfitting a hoplite soldier for a military career would have been nearly unattainable for a working-class Athenian, who probably earned no more than 1 drachma a day, if that. The complete panoply of weapons and armor for a hoplite warrior could cost several hundred drachmas to create, unless one's father bequeathed his own armor and weapons to his son. New recruits in Athens commenced their military training with tours of duty around the Attica Peninsula, where they might patrol the outlying villages and Athenian frontier while engaging in regular training exercises. This method of training enabled recruits to gain experience while keeping them close to home and relatively safe, as they learned and built discipline as a unit. No sources report whether or not Socrates fought in the Battle of Coronea, which was the initial major conflict of the Peloponnesian War. He would have been approximately 22 at the time, and of an age most likely to be conscripted. In the literature of the Socratic canon, Socrates is only explicitly mentioned as fighting in 2 specific battles, the Battle of Potidaea and the Battle of Delium. However, these 2 battles are separated by over a decade, and it might therefore be reasonable to infer that Socrates spent a considerable portion of his life as a career soldier. Socrates was 38 years old when the 3-year campaign of Potidaea began, and 46 years old when the Battle of Delium transpired. Athenian troops were rarely required to serve for such extended periods, particularly at such an advanced age, which might suggest that Socrates served voluntarily in these campaigns. If he served throughout such a lengthy duration voluntarily and during middle age, it might also be reasonable to surmise that he had also spent much of his younger life in his 20s or early 30s, becoming an adept and seasoned soldier. The image of the warrior philosopher is probably not one that many novice students of Socrates would anticipate encountering, considering his more renowned reputation in history as the barefoot, shabbily dressed, witty, and good-humored elderly intellectual. However, Socrates appears to have possessed an impressive martial reputation on the battlefield. Intriguingly, the name Socrates translates to safe in strength. His tolerance for discomfort, pain, and extreme temperatures was noted by his fellow troops and friends. He was said to have marched barefoot and uncomplaining through ice and snow, with little more than a light cloak to cover his armor and keep him warm. At the Battle of Potidaea, in 432 BC, he performed a daring rescue of his young protege Alcibiades, who had foolishly broken ranks and charged onto the battlefield in pursuit of the fleeing Corinthians. When Alcibiades impetuously charged forward, he did so alone, and the rest of his hoplite unit promptly closed up the gap their comrade had left, as they had been trained to do. None of his unit followed him forward. Breaking ranks in this manner was ill-advised indeed, and could potentially land a soldier in trouble with his superiors, for the shield of each soldier in the line helped to protect the body of the man next to him, and bolstered the strength of the line itself against attack. Breaking ranks placed one's fellow troops in real and immediate danger. When he witnessed his young friend fall before a reformed onslaught by the Corinthians, Socrates made the decision to break ranks himself. He rushed across the battlefield, through the chaos of men hacking each other to pieces, before he reached Alcibiades. Carefully and gently, he bore the young man away, along with his armor and fallen weapons, off the battlefield to safety. Consistent with Socrates' reputation for eschewing ambitions for glory, fame, or preferment, Plato recorded that Socrates insisted that Alcibiades, not himself, should be decorated for bravery. One historian has speculated that perhaps Socrates also avoided the adulation because he had in fact placed his own unit in danger to save his young friend's life. Like the image of the warrior, the image of the strong, daring, capable, and well-built young Socrates sits incongruously apart from our usual image of him as old, bearded, and stout, with a receding hairline, as he appears in his portraits and busts. Contemporaries of the elder Socrates, even his friends, described him as famously ugly. A short, balding man with a paunchy middle, a broad, snub nose, thick lips, and widely spaced eyes that appeared to bulge. However, in the first bloom of youth, as a career soldier, Socrates probably looked very different. Years of gymnastics, military training, if not slinging heavy stones in his father's workshop, would have given him a straight and well-built figure. His shortness would have appeared as stockiness and solid strength. He might even have been perceived as handsome, with his widely spaced eyes, broad nose, and very full lips situated in a younger face, and with what was likely an excellent physique. One is tempted to imagine someone akin to a young Marlon Brando. Although more than one biographer has sought to explore the figure of Socrates in love, we actually know very little about Socrates' personal or romantic life. Although, again, that certainly hasn't stopped historians from speculating and theorizing. One recent biography posits that as a young man, Socrates might have fallen in love with the famed intellectual Aspasia, a philosopher herself, and the de facto wife of Pericles. The textual evidence for this is rather thin. It involves accepting that a female figure named Diotima, whom Socrates mentions in Plato's Symposium as having been his instructress in all matters of love, is in fact Aspasia. The author points out that only one other woman who appears in any of Plato's other 30 dialogues as instructing any of her male contemporaries, including Socrates, is Aspasia herself in Plato's Menexenus. She is also depicted as leading philosophical discussions about love. While some historians might find this textual evidence a bit of a stretch, the circumstantial evidence is somewhat more interesting and perhaps slightly more compelling. Sometime during his mid-30s or early 40s, Socrates took on the role of tutor and mentor to the young Alcibiades. This was the very same youth he had rescued from the battlefield back in 432 BC, who was, in fact, a ward of Pericles. Pericles had become Alcibiades' guardian following the death of his friend Cleinias. The boy's father, years prior. It remains uncertain whether Socrates began mentoring Alcibiades before or after the Battle of Potidaea, but Plato notes that the two were tentmates and messmates throughout the campaign. Alcibiades was not only Pericles' ward, but also related to Aspasia through marriage. Aspasia, likely around the same age as Socrates, arrived in Athens in the early to mid-400s and 50s. At that time, her sister was married to Alcibiades the Elder, the grandfather of the younger Alcibiades. Aspasia resided in Athens for 2 years before establishing a household with Pericles, who was twice her age and with whom she had a son, Pericles the Younger. During her initial years in Athens, Aspasia rapidly gained renown for her impressive intellect, education, aristocratic demeanor, and beauty. Her banquets and symposia drew some of Athens' most distinguished citizens and thinkers, even Socrates himself, if Plato's account is accurate. Considering all of this, it becomes harder to dismiss the notion that Socrates moved within the same social circles as Pericles and Aspasia. Yet, if they were indeed friends, or at least social contemporaries, why does Plato make such sparing references to Aspasia? And why is Pericles, who at some point entrusted his ward and the son of his old friend to Socrates' care and mentorship, mentioned only once in any Socratic writings as having known or interacted with the renowned philosopher, a branch of Pericles' family, the Alcmaeonidae, even originated from the same village as Socrates? Xanthippe, whom Socrates married in his later years, is believed by some scholars to have been Pericles' cousin. Given these connections, one is inclined to view the near absence of both Pericles and Aspasia from the works of Plato and Xenophon as deliberate. Perhaps it was largely due to the widespread unpopularity Pericles endured later in life, or the public animosity and resentment directed towards Aspasia, who was labeled a harlot by many Athenians for her influence over Pericles. It's possible that neither Plato nor Xenophon wished to see Socrates tainted by association with these unpopular figures. Then again, a romantic relationship between Socrates and Aspasia in their early 20s, before her union with Pericles, might clarify why there are so many apparent links between the three, yet almost no documented interactions between them in the Socratic canon. While this remains largely speculative, it is nonetheless intriguing new scholarship for us to ponder. What is considerably more certain is that Socrates was married twice in his lifetime. His first wife was Myrto, the daughter of Lysimachus, a wealthy friend of his father, and the granddaughter of Aristides, the Just. Socrates is said to have refused a dowry from Myrto's father, another point supporting his relatively high status, as it likely suggests he did not require it. Little is known about Myrto, but she was probably several years younger than Socrates. Plato records that when Socrates died at 70, he had 2 sons approaching manhood. This suggests that Socrates' eldest son was born when he was in his late 40s or early 50s, implying that Myrto was likely at least a decade younger than her husband, if not more. Myrto and Socrates had 2 sons, Menexenus and Sophroniscus. At some point during his 50s, Socrates brought a young woman named Xanthippe into his household as his mistress. After his wife Myrto passed away, Socrates married Xanthippe, and they had a son named Lamprocles, who was apparently still a young child of indeterminate age when Socrates was executed in 399 BC. That being said, the details of Socrates' marriages are unclear, and some accounts suggest Socrates was exclusively married to Xanthippe in the intervals between his military duties and months, or even years, spent on campaign. Socrates continued his philosophical studies and development in his beloved Athens. He famously eschewed the pursuit of wealth and never accepted payment from the students he instructed. Some historians posit that Socrates inherited several rental properties, from which he derived his income, and he would also have received a salary and pension for his military service. This somewhat contradicts his reputation as an impoverished intellectual. Still, the image of Socrates most familiar to us is that of a modestly dressed, barefoot, affable, and urbane sage about town, who daily walked to the Athenian agora, or public square. There, he would frequent booksellers, converse with friends, engage in good-natured arguments with acquaintances, or take time to address the questions of his pupils. In this public space, he would have kept abreast of all city developments and become known to all Athenians, from political elites and priests to shopkeepers, artists, artisans, laborers, and his fellow citizens, young and old. Socrates regularly attended philosophical symposia in the homes of his wealthy friends, some of which are documented in the writings of Plato and Xenophon. These gatherings were essentially the ancient Greek equivalent of the 18th century French literary salon, where aristocratic, educated, intellectually accomplished, and avant-garde members of society convened to undertake serious examination and discussion of a specific philosophical inquiry, as well as to dine and drink together. Throughout his career as, quite literally, a public intellectual known to all Athenian citizens and willing to engage in dialogue with everyone, Socrates developed a body of beliefs and a method of inquiry that became part of the very foundation of modern Western civilization. By the time he reached adulthood, Socrates had become disillusioned with the natural philosophy that had so captivated him in his youth. The fields of physics and natural science were in their infancy at the time, and the limited questions they could claim to answer seemed to lack practical or social utility. What was the purpose, he wondered, of understanding the inner workings of the natural world if they could not address the universal why of human existence? Instead, he turned his mind towards epistemological and moral philosophy, two areas of inquiry he believed were far more crucial for human improvement, happiness, and social cohesion. Epistemology, the study of the nature and origin of knowledge, counts Socrates as one of its principal pioneers. What is knowledge? Socrates questioned. How is it acquired? How do we ascertain that the knowledge we possess is true? For Socrates, knowledge and its comprehension were essential for attaining virtue, which he believed in turn was essential for individual human happiness and broader social harmony. Ultimately, the acquisition of knowledge and virtues like justice, wisdom, courage, piety, and temperate living would cultivate individuals who acted in accordance with what was right and avoided wrongdoing. People who lived their lives in a morally incorrect manner were invariably wretched and miserable, Socrates believed, while those who lived according to moral and ethical standards were invariably happy. For Socrates, the continuous pursuit of self-knowledge was paramount. The unexamined life, he is famously believed to have remarked, is not worth living. Alongside self-knowledge, Socrates believed that moral improvement and the cultivation of the soul were equally important goals for all people, both as individuals and as members of their communities. In addition to the fields of epistemology and ethics, Socrates also pioneered techniques known to philosophers as elenchus, dialectic, and what educators term the Socratic method. This is essentially a question and answer style of conversation. Elenchus is a process of cross-examination designed to expose the inaccuracy of another's belief or hypothesis, while dialectic is a more collaborative question and answer exchange intended to foster reasoned conclusions or the emergence of knowledge. The dialectic approach is akin to what Socrates practiced during symposia, and what teachers who today employ the Socratic method do in their own classrooms when they utilize a guided question and answer approach to assist the class in reaching conclusions collectively. According to Socrates himself, it may have been his use of the elenchus technique that caused significant dislike of him to develop among his fellow Athenians. After all, few of us find it easy to appreciate people who seem determined to demonstrate that we are not as intelligent as we perceive ourselves to be. While defending himself at his own trial in Plato's Apology, Socrates recounted a series of events which, when they occurred, could not have failed to ignite public resentment against him for what was likely perceived as self-aggrandizement. This episode, he describes, also appears in Xenophon's Memorabilia, albeit with slight embellishments. The story goes that a friend of Socrates and fellow philosopher named Chaerephon visited the oracle at Delphi and asked of her, Who is wiser than Socrates? To the surprise and bewilderment of both men, the oracle replied, "No one is wiser than Socrates." This response utterly perplexed Socrates, whose first instinct was to reject the notion that he might be the wisest of all men. In Xenophon's version, Socrates was present when the oracle made her famous pronouncement, and he is said to have pondered long and thoughtfully upon the inscription etched above the entrance to Apollo's temple. "Know thyself." This experience, Socrates stated, spurred him to investigate the oracle's claim as thoroughly as he could, believing he would eventually prove her wrong. He described approaching and conversing with many of his fellow Athenians, commencing with those generally regarded as the most knowledgeable and accomplished in the city, such as politicians and scholars. He observed, however, that all of those whom others believed to be the most wise, and who believed themselves to be so, were invariably unable to conclusively defend their claims to superior knowledge. He then turned to the artisans and skilled tradesmen, who were indeed wise and competent in their particular craft pursuits, but possessed little knowledge or wisdom about loftier concerns, though many of them also believed themselves to be wise. The difference between Socrates and the individuals he questioned was that he made no claims to the superiority of his wisdom. "As for me, all I know is that I know nothing," he famously remarked. For Socrates, the near impossibility of ensuring that any knowledge constitutes an ultimate and verifiable truth should foster intellectual humility. The unspoken implication was that perhaps this was precisely what the Delphic oracle meant when she declared that no one is wiser than Socrates. No doubt Socrates employed his elenchus method in interrogating his fellow Athenians' claims to wisdom. This technique often culminates in what is known as aporia, an unresolvable logical impasse or dead end in an argument. As a man who openly claimed he did not possess all the answers, Socrates was not intent on telling people the right ones, but merely on demonstrating that through the acquisition of knowledge and the application of reason, one could expose the misguided beliefs of those who considered themselves wise. His ultimate lesson was to question everything, even supposedly settled knowledge, and to be aware that no matter how impressive one's intellectual attainments might be, one always finds oneself once again on the frontier of knowledge. Unfortunately, but quite predictably, many of his fellow Athenians took offense at his deconstruction of their beliefs and claims to wisdom, and Socrates' reduction of their arguments to a state of aporia surely made him many enemies, some of whom would eventually put him on trial for his life. The reputation and fame that Socrates attained during his life in Athens is evident not only in the works of scholars, but also artists. He was caricatured in the works of Athenian playwrights, most notably by Aristophanes in his comedy The Clouds, which premiered in Athens in 423 BC. This play lampooned Socrates as a skinny, half-mad, stringy-haired ascetic with absurdly high-flown ideas about the nature and workings of the heavens and the earth. His character was depicted floating above the stage in a basket suspended by ropes and pulleys, in which the old philosopher's own flatulence appeared to propel him here and there. In some respects, we must admit that comedy hasn't changed much in more than 2,000 years. Socrates' discussion and description of Aristophanes' play in Plato's Apology suggests that Socrates might have seen the comedy himself when it was performed in Athens. Aristophanes and Socrates were at least friendly acquaintances, if not friends, if the text in Plato's Symposium is to be believed. This text, and many others Plato wrote, illustrate that Socrates had a playful, easygoing nature and a great sense of humor. Socrates may have even thought Aristophanes' play was quite funny at the time. Sadly, the attributions made to him in such public forums, that he claimed superior knowledge of the heavens and the earth, would later come back to haunt him. Several more public marks against Socrates' reputation appeared over the next 15 years. Throughout this period, two of his former pupils were involved in political and military developments considered both reprehensible and treasonous by many Athenians, beginning with Socrates' beloved young pupil and friend Alcibiades. Elected general at just 30 years old, the handsome, dashing, and boastful Alcibiades convinced the Athenian assembly to undertake and grant him command of the Sicilian campaign, of 415 to 413 BC, he persuaded them to commission hundreds of ships, the deployment of 10,000 hoplite soldiers, and 30,000 naval men. It was by far the largest and most expensive force Athens had ever assembled. The day after it launched, political foes of Alcibiades leveled charges against him for profaning the mysteries. He was accused of vandalizing numerous shrines to the god Hermes and for making light of the gods in public at a masquerade. The Athenian authorities dispatched troops to Sicily to arrest Alcibiades, who then escaped and defected to the side of the Spartans. Alcibiades' betrayal brought significant intelligence advantages to the Spartans and utter disaster to the Sicilian campaign, resulting in the biggest military loss in troops and ships in Athenian history up until that point. This was a financial catastrophe, which many Athenians blamed for the weakening of their military strength at a particularly crucial juncture of the Peloponnesian War. Athens was defeated in 404 BC, at which time the Spartans installed an oppressive oligarchic council to rule the formerly democratic Athens. This body became known as the 30 Tyrants, who governed Athens until 403 BC, when they were overthrown by pro-democracy. Athenians and the previous regime was restored. Prominent among the 30 tyrants was a man called Critias, another former pupil of Socrates. When he and the rest of the Spartan junta were finally removed from power, pro-democracy Athenians remembered the old association between the know-it-all philosopher and his authoritarian pupil. The anger against the two young men, whom many viewed as arch-traitors to Athens, made Socrates seem guilty by association, rather than by any action of his own. His enemies also noted that Socrates was not censured or punished by Critias or the 30 for refusing to arrest a man he knew to be innocent, Leon of Salamis, whom the oligarchs wanted to execute. This is the only instance in which Socrates is known to have served in public office. He served a one-year term from 404 to 403 BC, and it was likely only the fall of the tyrants that saved him from their wrath. Still, after all the upheaval wrought by two traitors to Athens, many continued to mutter darkly about Socrates and to wonder if his pupil's actions were the fault of their mentor. In 399 BC, 3 men of Athens, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, brought charges against Socrates for impiety and for corrupting the city's youth. They claimed that Socrates had denied the existence of the gods of Athens, invented new gods, claimed to understand the workings of the heavens and the earth, and that he used his talent for rhetoric to corrupt and lead young people astray. To the modern ear, few, if any, of these charges sound like prosecutable crimes. However, the justice system of classical Athens featured no official prosecutors or defense attorneys. All prosecutorial actions were initiated by private citizens. The accusers and accused were each given an equal amount of time to present their case. This time limit was determined by a water clock, which applied only to the speeches of the accuser and accused. The clock was stopped temporarily whenever a witness was called. Cases were heard by the thesmothetai, or judges of Athens, and verdicts were decided by a jury of 500 Athenians selected by lot. The rationale for impaneling such large juries was that it would make bribery nearly impossible. Socrates used his allotted time and his verbal skills to defend himself as thoroughly as possible. His defense forms the full text of Plato's Apology, an ironic title given, there's nothing apologetic about it. Socrates took his time addressing and deconstructing each charge, demonstrating that none were founded in fact. He pointed out that he had inadvertently made enemies of his accusers in the past by exposing their pretensions of wisdom as false. He sensed his accusers now leveled charges at him that were based on unfounded rumors, suppositions, and public propaganda that had been circulated about Socrates at various times over the years. The jury found Socrates guilty nonetheless, by a slim margin of just 30 votes. When his time came to be sentenced, his accusers demanded the death penalty. Athenian justice stipulated that a defendant who was found guilty might propose their own punishment, which a jury might accept, as it demonstrated remorse and an attempt at restitution. It was also an opportunity for a jury to use their judgment as to whether the harsher punishment often demanded by accusers was warranted. Socrates seems to have inadvertently harmed his own case at this stage of the trial, but his reasoning was clear. Since he maintained he was not guilty of the crimes of which he was accused, to volunteer himself for punishment would be to concede that he had done something wrong, which he had not. He had dedicated his life to the cultivation and improvement of his beloved city, freely imparting his knowledge and instruction to anyone who sought it, for which he never charged any fees. His modest clothing, bare feet, and temperate habits could clearly attest to his poverty, as he described it, which he gladly endured since he viewed all ambitions for wealth and glory as leading to unhappiness and corruption. In fact, Socrates asserted that, instead of being punished, he ought to be rewarded, and requested that the city of Athens offer him free meals for life, as public benefactors and victorious Olympians received. This suggestion may well have been a joke, but it likely did not resonate well. Socrates concluded with an offer to pay a fine of 100 drachmas, which amounted to about a fifth of his estate. If this were unacceptable, he said, 4 friends of his who were present at the trial, Plato himself, Crito, Critobulus, and Apollodorus, were prepared to pay a fine of 3,000 drachmas on Socrates' behalf. The jury sentenced Socrates to death, strangely by a larger margin than the verdict that convicted him. When asked if he had anything to say, Socrates spoke directly to the jury. To those who had recognized the justice in his defense, he offered thanks and praise for their civic and judicial integrity. Those who had condemned him, he stated, had ultimately condemned themselves in the eyes of history, and he prophesied that men would always speak of their actions as deliberately dishonorable. Still, as a loyal Athenian committed to the rule of law, he accepted the verdict and his sentence. Socrates spent about a month in jail prior to his execution, which was indeed a rare occurrence, as sentences were normally carried out within a day or two. However, the day before Socrates' trial, the annual religious pilgrimage to the island of Delos began. The pilgrimage commemorated Theseus' defeat of the Minotaur. According to tradition, until the ship returned to Athens, no criminals could be executed in the city. Socrates, therefore, had to wait several weeks for his sentence to be carried out. This was a luxury that few condemned people in the ancient world enjoyed. Socrates spent the time putting his affairs in order, spending time with his family, and receiving visits from his friends. He was well tended by his jailer, who clearly held him in esteem and dreaded the task of carrying out the execution. Plato's Crito and Phaedo meticulously document the final days of Socrates' life. His friends, most notably Crito, earnestly implored him to escape from prison. It was undeniably clear, Crito and others argued, that he had been unjustly condemned. Even his jailer, they pointed out, had offered to facilitate his escape. However, Socrates steadfastly refused. He had lived in Athens his entire life, he reasoned. It had afforded him a life he valued enough to remain there and raise his children there. In doing so, he had implicitly consented to abide by the laws and judgments of Athenian institutions. Despite the fact that justice had failed him in this instance, that was no justification for him to become a lawbreaker himself, by which action he would sacrifice all his integrity and jeopardize his soul. For Socrates, 2 wrongs did not constitute a right. On his last day, Socrates spent some private moments with his sons and his wife, Xanthippe. As the day progressed, he sent them away, sparing them from having to witness his execution, which was scheduled to occur at sunset. He devoted his remaining hours on earth engaging in conversation with his friends on the nature of life and death, his convictions regarding the soul's immortality, and his belief that death was not the ultimate end. He offered solace when some among them began to weep. As sunset drew near, he posed the question, who can definitively say whether death is not preferable to life? When his jailer arrived with a draught of hemlock, Socrates bade them all farewell before consuming the poison and reclining on his bed to await the end. His final words, spoken to his friend Crito before covering his face with a piece of cloth, were, "I owe a cock to Asclepius. Do not forget to pay the debt." Scholars have endlessly debated the significance of these words. Asclepius was a deified hero of cult worshippers who believed he could prevent or cure illness if sacrifices were made to him. Did Socrates have a genuine debt to settle with a deity he believed had previously intervened on his behalf? Did he perhaps perceive life as the ailment from which he was being cured, and ask Crito to offer a thanksgiving sacrifice for him? The debate continues, as do many others concerning the life of Socrates. Despite the numerous unresolved questions surrounding him, Socrates has attained a level of enduring fame and immortality comparable only to religious figures in history, such as Buddha, Jesus, or Lao Tzu. All four were teachers who placed a significant emphasis on self-knowledge and the cultivation of the soul for moral improvement. But uniquely among them, Socrates was never deified. This is not to suggest that Socrates lacked influence on religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. Socrates' ideas on the nature and immortality of the soul and his ethical viewpoints had an immeasurable impact on the early fathers of the Christian Church. The Socratic canon remains a cornerstone in the libraries of Christian theology scholars today. Furthermore, his influence on education, law, and politics is still remarkably apparent in the present day. Socratic teaching methods are standard practice in Western classrooms at all levels of education. Political and legal scholars continue to debate precisely where Socrates stood on the spectrum of democracy versus oligarchy, or regarding social contract theory versus civil disobedience. Of course, not every subsequent philosopher or writer admired or concurred with Socrates' ideas, most notably Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously attacked the beliefs of Socrates in his 19th century works, Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist. Socrates' greatest contribution to us is considered by many to be his championing of empiricism and reason. Despite his rejection of natural philosophy, Socrates never reached any conclusion, even those concerning metaphysical phenomena such as the soul, without employing a reasoned and logical approach, which was always open to question and critique. His epistemological framework for establishing truth based on observable evidence would eventually be developed by Aristotle into the first form of the scientific method. Finally, Socrates' doctrine of superior authority helped establish, for the first time, that there existed a higher authority beyond the political or legal realms, which offer only the threat of force to compel compliance. For Socrates, this higher authority might be divine, or his own moral conscience, or perhaps reason itself. There is reason to believe he viewed these entities as quite intimately connected, though he refused to escape from an unjust imprisonment and execution. And while ultimately his enemies achieved their immediate aim of harming his physical being, Socrates was ultimately triumphant. Plato, Xenophon, and other writers immortalized him as a martyr for reason and integrity. The ongoing quest for the historical Socrates persists, and while some might deem this pursuit futile, considering the scarcity of sources available and the doubts surrounding their potential authenticity, many historians take their cue from Socrates himself, even if one of his dialectics concluded in an irresolvable aporia, with the sense that the answer might remain perpetually unknown or unsettled. That provided no justification to cease questioning, though a clear picture of the historical Socrates has largely remained stubbornly out of reach. Scholars will likely continue to pursue this most elusive figure, who paradoxically looms larger than almost anyone in the history of Western civilization. What are your thoughts on Socrates? Does he merit the title of Father of Western Philosophy? Please share your opinions in the comment section. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching People Profiles documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to click the bell icon to receive notifications, ensuring you never miss an upload. Thank you very much for watching.